Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 edition of the Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. My name is Francois Terry, and I'll be your host today. So today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present a regular guest of the Speaker Series, our very own Darren Tanke. Darren is a preparation technician at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, and a position he has occupied for nearly 42 years now. Darren grew up in Calgary, Alberta. He first started working in the Palaeontology department of the Provincial Museum of Alberta in 1979, originally as a volunteer. Darren moved to Drumheller during the early phase of development of the Royal Tyrrell Museum to work as a preparation technician, and has been here ever since. Darren's interests focus on dinosaur paleontology and pathologies, but he is also interested in the early history of paleontological research in Alberta. Darren has conducted field activities in numerous countries, including Canada, the US, China, Argentina, Australia, Mongolia, England, France, and Norway. Today, Darren will present an overview of his efforts to relocate dinosaur quarries dating back to the first half of the 20th century and interesting developments surrounding a 100-year-old ankylosaur quarry that is still producing bones today. So without further delay, I present you Mr. Darren Tanke. So Darren, the microphone is yours.
Okay, so Alberta is well known for its dinosaur fossils, and that's all well and good, but there's a troubling legacy that comes with these dinosaurs being collected, and that is that a lot of them were properly documented. And if you want to be a paleontologist, you need to have precise locality information for these dinosaur skeletons. Otherwise, their scientific value is greatly reduced. So the story today takes place in Dinosaur Provincial Park in southeastern Alberta, but this story could also take place anywhere in the world where dinosaurs are found, because worldwide, the poor record keeping of dinosaur locality information is a problem as well. And this goes back 150 years. So there are probably thousands and thousands of dinosaurs known that have little to no or poor locality data. A lot of old pictures were taken in the day, and these are useful for trying to find what we call lost quarries. These are quarries that we know have to exist because the dinosaurs in a museum on display or in a collections area. The other quarries that I'm going to talk about are mystery quarries. These are sites where we find an old quarry, but we have no idea of who was there, when, or what was collected. So this is a picture taken in 1914, and here's the same scene today. And if we put them side by side, you can see that there are some differences, but generally the scenery stays much the same. But you cannot see a quarry in the foreground there, in the right foreground. It's completely eroded away and been overtaken by sagebrush. So the quarry is obliterated for that matter. In the 1880s, surveyors came to Alberta in the advance of settlers coming here, and they gridded out the entire province using the land description system, and they even hammered in big steel stakes to show where the sections and quarter sections were, so when settlers came to Alberta, they knew exactly where their land was, where they would settle and grow crops and raise a family. This system was in place in the 1880s, and rudimentary maps existed, but the early dinosaur collectors chose not to use them, which causes huge problems for us today. What they would do is refer to a geographical place. It could be a bridge, a ferry crossing, or a town. And in Dinosaur Provincial Park, they use this town here, Steveville, which no longer exists, and they would refer to the distance this site was from this town. So This is the best locality data we have. 10 miles below Steville, right bank. Now, if I'm standing on the right bank where the town is looking upriver, I am on the right bank. But if I turn around and face downriver, now I'm on the left bank. And that took a number of years to figure out which direction they were looking. Turns out they were always looking downriver. 100 feet above the river, it's a ballpark number. You see 100, 150. It's never a precise number, like 102 feet. So you can tell they're just ballparking these numbers. If I go 10 miles below Steville on the right bank, 100 feet above the river, this is what I find. And I could show you hundreds and hundreds of other photographs of Badlands scenery 10 miles below Steville. So that locality information is pretty much useless. As I said, they took lots of pictures, and pictures are great because they show you what you're looking for. And if you are familiar with the Badlands, sometimes these scenes are very familiar to you, and you can go back to them and identify the site. This site here was worked in 1922 by the Chicago Field Museum, and all the rubble piled behind them had eroded away, and all evidence of the quarry had been lost. And then one of our crew in 1982 refound this site as a new dinosaur, not knowing that the Chicago Field Museum had been there many years earlier. One of the problems, though, with photographs is that they can either deliberately or accidentally be printed backwards. And here you can see on my shirt, it says Bridgewater, and you can see which side is oriented correctly. But I think you would agree that the Badlands backwards or forwards look just the same. There's no point of reference to show you that it's backwards or forwards. Other photographs give some locality data. Square Butte east of Sand Creek. Well, there's lots of Square Buttes east of Sand Creek. And Chasmosaur Quarry, well, there were 5 excavated that year. So which one is it? So sometimes the information provided is not useful either. Knowing this, in the mid-1930s, it was decided to quarry stake major dinosaur quarries in Dinosaur Provincial Park and Drumheller, with Dinosaur Provincial Park taking priority if no money could be collected for both. And so they ended up in 1935-36 quarry staking with the quarry marker you see on the lower left, only Dinosaur Provincial Park, and only sites that they thought were important. Some of these sites that they thought were not important, we now know are important, so we've had to relocate those unstaked quarries. These are brass or aluminum heads welded onto a pipe. We drill a hole in the floor of the quarry, pour in concrete, and then set the pipe vertically into the hole. And once that concrete sets, the data, which is also stamped on, you see here, these are all unmarked quarry heads. We stamp numbers and other information into them. So when the concrete sets, they're like a tombstone. It tells you exactly what was collected from that spot, by whom, and when. These quarry markers were all tied into this map, which came out in 1950, showing all the quarries that were staked. And on the right-hand side is a listing of what the numbers mean. If we zoom in, you can see it. It gives you who was there, when, and what was collected. But I have discovered about a 10% error factor where the year is wrong, the collector is wrong, or the dinosaur is wrong. So even this documentation comes with some limitations. Quarry stakes also have issues. On the left, you can see where the pipe is sticking above the ground, and the lower half of it is fully exposed. So this is a quarry excavated in 1919, and I took that picture probably 20 years ago now. So the hillside and the Badlands have eroded down probably around 18 inches there. Quarry stakes can also be slumped. The back wall can slump and bury them. And we've had issues of vandalism where people yanking them out of the ground or marring the data on the heads as well. This is an issue more in Drumheller, where there is no provincial park. So in Dinosaur Provincial Park, there's less opportunity for vandalism. So here I am pulling my hair out. We have all these sites that were not staked. Some were marked wrong. Some were not documented in any way. And some of them, sites are given land descriptions. They've decided to get more accurate, and that information is wrong as well. We have the 1950 map issue being incorrect in some cases. We have photographs unidentified, misidentified, printed backwards. We've got photographs scattered worldwide. In fact, I have seen in San Diego, they have pictures from Dinosaur Provincial Park in Alberta, Canada, identified as New Mexico, USA. There's also inconsistent field note records, and the published historical accounts are sometimes incorrect. I am basically rewriting history. The quarry sites are eroding away. I've been using faces to identify who was in the crew, but they change over advancing years. So, for example, Levi Sternberg in 1919 does not look like Levi Sternberg in 1954. His face changes that much. We have lots of transient summer staff who are there only for one summer. And now, to add a whole wrinkle to all this, incomplete sampling of sites, which I'll talk about a little later. So this is how I feel I am. I'm interested in history of Alberta vertebrate paleontology. The history happened, but it has become so tangled up because of misinformation, poor documentation, that I basically, here I am trying to untangle this great ball of wire, and I don't know if I'll have enough lifetime left in me to get it all sorted out. So I might have to pass a torch to someone down the road. So how do we solve these sites? It can be done. I've solved with others about 40 in the Drumheller area, and in Dinosaur Provincial Park, mostly on my own, I've solved, I think, 41 so far, including some type specimens, the very first specimens of their kind ever known. So I use field notes, the field photographs. There are motion picture films as well, historical accounts from books and newspapers, garbage analysis, which is the most important, and I'm going to talk about that later. I can do a lot of internet research. I can match photographs with skylines on Google Earth, even geography and geology. I can match vegetation and river patterns to maps and Google Earth, and I can even match geology and stratigraphy. So I Googled the word garbage and in Google Images, and I got this picture on the left, and there's not a lot of stuff here that's useful for dating purposes, but the Griffey for president, I knew Griffey was a baseball player, so I Googled it, and in 1996, as a joke, his teammates were trying to get him to run for president. So we know that this photograph is from around 1996. It could be no older than 1996. So there's one line of evidence to help date this photograph. In the field, a lot of the collectors were not very careful about taking out their garbage. They just left it behind, which is a boon for me because a lot of this trash can be identified to its vintage, which gives us clues as to the vintage of the quarry. On the left, we can see a mystery bottle, a clear one from 1922, and then a purple one from 1922 possibly. And I can even see in bottle collectors' catalogs what the bottle looked like in its entirety and what it contained. So it even tells us a little bit about what they were eating back then. The purple glass is important because prior to about 1920, the glass had a lot of imperfections in it, a lot of chemical additives in it, which turned purple when exposed to UV light. So if I see bottle fragments that are purple, I know that I'm looking at a site about 1920, 21, 22, or older. In some cases, we can even go to antique shops. On the right here, we have the top of a canning jar, and I went to an antique shop and found an identical one. So I know what the whole bottle would look like. These are what we would recognize as moonshine jugs. This is not alcohol consumption on site. But we learned that from around 1917 to the early 20s, that these jugs were used to hold shellac, which is the glue that they were using at that time to hold the dinosaur bones together so they wouldn't crumble and erode away. So if I find even a tiny fragment of a moonshine jug at an unidentified site, I know it's probably 1917 to 1922, somewhere in there. In some cases, we even find artifacts that are in the old photographs. On the left here, you can see they're working on a Plesiosaurus quarry in 1921, and there's a whole series of these photos, and in all of them, you can see this one small tin can with a paintbrush in it used for holding glue, and there's never any other tin can, so I'm pretty sure that the tin can on the right is the same one that's in these old photographs. Another way I help solve these mysteries is the cluster effect, where we have one collector, one area, and 1 year. So if I'm looking for a lost Levi Sternberg quarry from 1933, 1934, you can see a lot of them cluster out in the upper middle left of the photograph. So I would go there first looking for a lost quarry, or if I found a mystery quarry there, it's potentially Levi Sternberg 1933, 1934. In the early 2000s, we were working at the Albertosaurus bone bed, where Barnum Brown had spent several weeks collecting a fair number of specimens. But when we went back over several years, we were unable to reproduce his results. So there were some thoughts that maybe we were in the right bone bed, but in the wrong spot in the bone bed. Shortly later, we realized that there was a pile of rubble that had been overgrown by scrub, and it was a spoil pile from the 1910 excavation. So we dug through it and found these impressions of toe bones in rock. It made sense to me that if the site was right where we were working, that's where the spoil pile would be. They would not haul the rock from somewhere else and dump it where we were. So I gave the rock on the left, the impression of the bone in the rock on the left, to a colleague who was going to New York City, and asked him to try to do the Cinderella slipper trick. And when he got there, within 5 minutes, he was able to stick the bone back in that rock sample. So we knew we were in the right spot in the bone bed. And the reason we weren't replicating Barnum Brown's results is because he skimmed the cream off the surface and took all the best specimens. Newspaper is the absolute best thing to find in an old quarry. The year of the newspaper is almost always the year of the quarry, and the source of the newspaper often can be linked to the institution that was excavating there. So the Toronto Star newspaper from 1917 would tell me Royal Ontario Museum 1917 was in that quarry. So that's fun, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up when we cleaned the paper off and saw the mailing label on one of the pieces of newspaper. George F. Sternberg was there in 1922. Pretty cool. The old newspaper is used for a variety of things. As a separator between the bone and the plaster jacket, when they were making the wet plaster on burlap on top of the separating layer of newspaper. It was used for wrapping small packages. As we see here, this package is still at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, unopened, from 1937. It was used for fire starter. We know that they used newspaper and wood to make little campfires to heat their coffee, and we have evidence of them using it for toilet paper as well. This is often what the newspaper looks like, just these tiny, tiny little fragments. And when I started this project, I had to take my little piece of newspaper to a library in Calgary and scroll through miles and miles and miles of microfilm. Thank goodness it's all digitized and online now. But these tiny fragments can yield a lot of information. And a lot of people are shocked that this newspaper would survive. 1950 newspaper found 75, 80 years later. Once it's buried, it's protected from rain, it's protected from frost, from insects, from rodents, from wind. But we also find newspaper right on the surface. A couple of years ago, we found 1918 newspaper sitting right on the surface, still there. as a demonstration of how fragile things can survive, here we have a photograph taken in 1922. The men are lifting a plaster jacket up with a block and tackle and a tripod, and they're going to push the wagon back under the lifted jacket and lower it into the wagon. And they've put some hay or straw in the wagon for padding material, and the horses are watching them work. And one of the horses is eating the straw or hay out of the wagon and spilling it onto the ground, as you can see. So I said, let's go back and find that straw the horse spilled. And the guy I was with was like, that's nuts. So we went and we dug down a couple centimeters, and there it was. 77 years later, the horses spilled hay. So I've told you all that, and I was telling a group of people this very same story when we were in Dinosaur Park, and I came upon this scene, and I got very excited because that rock in the lower left was put there by someone a long time ago. How do I know? When we went to the rock and looked at it, it was broken into 3 pieces, and that white material on there, that's not bird poop. It is lichen, white lichen that's growing down and into the cracks. That rock was put there a long time ago. I looked around a little bit more, and I found what was left of a pail. And that could only have rolled downhill. So I climbed uphill, and I found some bits of plaster of Paris, the material that is used to make our plaster of Paris jacket when jacketing a dinosaur skeleton. Looking around a little bit more, I found a wad of newspaper in the wall of the quarry. So we know that the newspaper is critical, so we collected that, and we cleaned it, and clues started to appear. As a car buff, an antique car buff, I recognized this car right away as a late 20s, early 30s model. Unfortunately for me, the artist did not put the year of the car on the license plate. So we looked at some more clues, and we got these pieces, which were priceless. These pieces of paper solved the site for us. We have flapper style clothing, which is from the late 20s, early 30s. 831, if you look at any cartoon today, you will see somewhere a number. 831 means August 31. So I know that the paper was published on August 31st. Then on the other piece of paper, it's an article on traffic accidents in Toronto, and they say in the upper box, last year, 1926. So I know it's August 31st, 1927, but I needed confirmation. So I called a library in Toronto and asked them to do a search for me, and I was told, no, we can't do that. We're not allowed to do searches. So I explained the project I was working on, and she's like, don't tell my boss. And she went and checked it out for me, and within 10 minutes, she had confirmed for me it was indeed a Toronto newspaper. So we knew it was a Royal Ontario Museum quarry. And there's the site right there. You barely see it. Now I want to talk about the problems of sampling and incomplete collecting, further complicated by lack of documentation. It's a serious issue. One issue is headhunting. Early dinosaur collectors thought nothing of just lopping the heads off skeletons. When we think of headhunters today, we think of primitive tribes in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But these men were also headhunters, men whose names are well known to anyone that works in paleontology. These men would sample or lop off the heads of animals and take them back to their respective museums, causing a lot of confusion. These are 3 hadrosaur skulls that were headhunted. The one in the upper right, we were able to reassociate a couple of years back to a skeleton that was still left in the ground, which has now been collected, and the skull and the skeleton are together. The 2 bottom ones, I've seen the sites, and there are partial skeletons that have no heads. They've been headhunted. Sampling is a problem too. Not every dinosaur skeleton you find is necessarily perfect. There are parts eroded off or parts that were never preserved. So if you're mounting a skeleton and you need a leg bone or some toe bones, and you find a skeleton that has those things, you could just take them and run with them. So here's the first documented case that I found in 1910, where Peter Kaizen mentions finding 2 trachodon or duckbill dinosaur skeletons, and that they were no good, but the limbs were fair. And then the next day, they took a front limb. So there's a dinosaur somewhere in Alberta missing a front leg that's at the American Museum, which we've been able to document as AMNH 5200. Here's another one involving the Sternbergs. They collected a Tyrannosaur hind leg. I was able to relocate the site and see that there were more bones there. And then about 5 years later, someone spotted a jaw that was just starting to erode out. So we could reassociate these animals on this screen in a digital way, but not in a physical way. So we need to go back to this site at some point and see what's going on there. The main thing I want to tell you about is a project that we're working on now involving an ankylosaur. The story starts in Dinosaur Park on July the 4th, 2007. I was out in the Badlands prospecting for fossils, and I came upon wire, a can rim, and a nail. They weren't sitting together like this. They were scattered over about a 20 square foot area. And that's all there was, just these pieces of wire and metal. There was an old quarry about 100 feet away that I thought might be related to this wire, but I could not be sure. So I just left the wire there. I put it in my GPS and went on my merry way. In 2018, Dr. Caleb Brown and I were prospecting in the area, and I wanted to show him the wire, but when we arrived, this bone was sticking out of the rock. It was not there in 2007, but it was there in 2018 and already beginning to erode away. We realized pretty quick it was an ankylosaur tibia, and we don't find a lot of those, so we decided to collect it as a single bone. But soon we discovered an ankylosaur femur alongside it and some ankylosaur tendons. So we're like, whoa, 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 what's going on here? That wire began to take on greater significance. Was that wire part of an old quarry? So I got on the ground and looked around, and I found a tiny, tiny, like pinhead size piece of plaster of Paris. So we knew this was an old quarry, but we didn't know who, when, or what. Big mystery. So this is an ankylosaur. We thought it would be something resembling something like this with the club on the end of the tail. As we were working on the quarry, I stood up one day to stretch my legs and turned around and had this huge epiphany. I realized I had seen some years earlier an old photograph that had a wedge of dark clay in the rock in the background of the quarry picture. And I remembered that someone had sent me that photograph at my government email. So we went back to my government email and found this. 4 years and 2 months earlier, someone had sent me this image, and it said AMNH, American Museum of Natural History, 1913 ankylosaur. So now we knew the year, who, and what kind of animal, but we didn't know what specimen number. And why I would remember a wedge of clay in a photograph 4 years and 2 months earlier, or 2 months later, I don't know. It's just the way my head is wired, I guess. But I was right. And here's the quarry side by side. You can see it's definitely the same site. As we excavated down around the tibia and femur, looking for more bones, we came to the edge of the quarry. You could see in situ rock that was still untouched by nature or human hands, and the ex situ rock, this is the rubble from the quarry that they dumped over to the side that had collapsed and reconstituted itself into ex situ rock. As we dug down some more, we found even that the quarry had filled in over time, and even mud cracks had formed. So we realized this because the quarry is at a slight angle, about 8-degree angle. So it's deeper the further back you go. So it would fill in with water. And that partly might be the reason why the quarry wasn't visible to me in 2007. The site was just completely filled in and eroded away. Because it was at an angle, and would fill in with water, we had to dig a drainage trench. We don't want to have our dinosaur bones sitting in water. And as I dug the drainage trench, we came upon newspaper, old newspaper. So we cleaned it off and started doing internet searches. And while this is not an exact match, it does show that it is 1913 newspaper from Manitoba Free Press. And it's a summer issue, so that made sense as well. So we went to the 1913 American Museum field notes and recorded all the ankylosaur specimens they found. You don't have to read all of this, but they talk about animals, where they're found, where they're not found, what side of the river, etc. So we were able to eliminate all the ones bolded in red, which left us with two unbolded, AMNH 5404 and 5405. 5404 already had a quarry marker in it. So that meant that our site had to be 5405. And 5405 is a very important ankylosaur specimen. It's been widely used in a variety of university theses, PhD and master's level theses, and full-scale publications. It was also recently decided that it was a new genus called Platypelta. So we were quite excited to find all this. 5405 said that it had caudal plates, highlighted in green. The tail club on ankylosaurs consists of fused vertebrae from the tip of the tail and a series of plates or osteoderms that form the tail club, or knob, as it's sometimes called. So we were looking forward to finding more of this tail club, more knobs. So at the end of the 2018 field season, we had the femur, the tibia, we had tendon bundles from the tail, and we had this big chunk of armor at the top. So here's the tendons close up, and Ian McDonald found this massive caudal plate. Very exciting, but unfortunately the field season ended and we had to leave it for the over the winter. So we glued it and covered it up and left it over the winter. I'm going to put a red oval on this picture to help orient you in the subsequent shots that I will discuss. So we thought that what Ian had found was part of the major plate of a tail club, and that what we would find is what's outlined in the blue box. Well, none of this is true. We were so certain that we had identified this site correctly, but the last 8 slides, as it turns out, are totally not true, and I'll show you what happened. As I dug around looking for one major plate, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we realized it was a complete tail club, which caused problems. Beautiful specimen. It's almost as long as I am tall. It's one of the most perfect ankylosaur tail clubs known from the province. So either 5405 had 2 tails, or we were wrong. So we have to go back to the drawing board, try to solve this mystery. I went back into some in-house reports at the American Museum, and Barnard Brown talks about a partial skeleton of Ankylosaurus in which the pelvis and posterior dorsal series with ribs attached was uncovered, and 2 other specimens that they wanted to work on next year. And when we see where these specimens are, our animals in the lower right, the 2 other specimens he's talking about in that report are not very far away. So that was all good. When we look at the old photograph and do just an interpretive sketch, you can see that the ribs do form a line of ribs, like as in life, and they're not attached to each other. If the ribs on the left side of that blue bar attached to the ribs on the right side of the blue bar, we'd have ribs, 9 or 10 feet long. So the midline of this specimen is where the blue bar is. So this is a associated or articulated skeleton, like Barnard Brown described. He even talks about it in a newspaper article that they'd found it almost reproduce weird ankylosaurs in its entirety. And then I found this newspaper article. They always say, don't believe what you read in a newspaper, but here's an example where you can. They talk about how they found specimens last year and they will dig up this summer. So that told us that they worked the site over 2 summers. We went back to the field reports for 1914. They only found 2 that year. One they sampled, 5347, and that left 5337 as our animal, which has also been referred to Platypelta coombsi. So it worked both years. They usually worked each site and finished it the same year. So this was the first. 5337 is one of the most complete ankylosaurs known from Dinosaur Park, and now even more so. It was a lost site, so we have spatial and stratigraphic context for it. And it's only the second ankylosaur that has the skull and tail club in association. And if it is Platypelta coombsi, then the lost type locality is now known and the skeleton is more complete. But how do we really know it is 5337? As you just saw, we got burned once already. So how do we know? Well, I took the drawing of an ankylosaur, Euoplocephalus, and I marked it with numbers. So in the upper image, you can see for the lower front legs, they got 2 radii, 2 ulnae, and they got 1 skull, 1 lower jaw. If we found an ulna from an ankylosaur in our quarry, we'd be really in a lot of trouble. We don't want any duplication of elements. So you can see the AM&H has the front 2/3 of an animal, and we have the back third. There is one bone that both museums have an example of, and that's the one right in the pelvis, right above the right knee, the one with a number 1 on it. That is the ischium, part of the pelvis, and we have one, and the American Museum has one. They are a left and one is a right. They do have different colors, but they used different glues back then, the shellac, which probably darkens the bone up. And by measurement, one bone is 3 millimeters longer than the other. So that is a good match to show that this is indeed 5337. Another issue now, because of sampling, is after the American Museum walked away from site in 1914, other people, other museums, other independent collectors have been to Dinosaur Park and wandered through these Badlands. It's possible that any of these museums could have unknowingly collected bones from this animal, not knowing that parts of it were already in the American Museum. It's entirely possible. But how do we know? We just don't. This is the problem. You got to collect the whole animal when you uncover it. So it raises the specter of true specimen completeness. You know, with the high erosion rates in Dinosaur Park, how would you know that the animal's been headhunted, sampled, or partially collected before? How would you ever know? It'd be very hard to know. Just to show you how close the American Museum came to getting these bones, if they dug back another meter, they would have found the hind limb and tendons block, and while trenching that, they would have found the tail club. At the Royal Trail Museum, for animals that are disarticulated, skeletons that have fallen apart before they got finally buried, we always dig back at least 1 meter and then stop there. So they could have found more of that animal, and they didn't. So we want to reopen this quarry, but unfortunately last year, and it looks like this year, COVID-19 has sunk our efforts to do that kind of work. There are more bones missing. We're missing both hands, 1 mandible, the predentary. We're missing both hind feet, although we do have 1 bone, which shows us that there might be more of the hind feet. The neck vertebrae and ribs, the caudal vertebrae between the tail club and the pelvis, those are missing. And there seems to be a curious lack of armor at both institutions. These things were covered with a lot of armor. It's possible that the animal, when it died and was in the river, was upside down. There's a good paper that came out recently that shows ankylosaurs tended to end up on their backs after death, and perhaps the animal, as it decayed, slid off the pointy back armor that was anchored into the river bottom and slid off a short distance and became disarticulated and buried there. So we need to go back and have a look for more. Problem is 8-degree dip roughly. So for every foot we want to go back, we have to go down further and further. So it's going to be a lot of work if we decide to do it. Here's the site last year. You can already see that it's eroding away. If we look more closely at one edge of the site, you can see these sharp edges have already rounded off, and there's rills, those erosion features that you see where the water runs through, forming already. Plants are already starting to take over, and on the middle left, you can see there's already mud cracks forming, just like the early mud cracks that we found earlier, I showed you earlier. So where do we go from here? We have one animal, 2 museums, 2 catalog numbers that we know of. There could be other bones in other museums. We could surrender all of our bones to the American Museum, but that is not going to happen. We could ask the American Museum to surrender all their bones to us. That's unlikely to happen. So minimally, there will be a mutual sharing of data, site photographs, measurements, 3D photogrammetry models, and certainly a revised anatomical description is in order. But what I'm hoping will happen is that we can mold all of the original material and exchange casts. So we would get casts of the American Museum material, and they would get casts of the Royal Tyrrell Museum material. We could either mold, or we could do this. We could take multiple photographs of the tail club and the other bones and create 3D photogrammetry models. And from that, we could 3D print replica bones to trade. That might be the quickest and easiest way to do it. By doing so, we would have more or less complete skeletons of this animal, the Oplocephalus or Platypelta, in Drumheller and in New York City. So it'd be available, less travel involved for researchers on the eastern half of the continent or the western half. So the hard lessons learned. It's important. If you're a kid that wants to be a paleontologist, or a student that wants to be a paleontologist, or if you're even a paleontologist, you need to properly record your site locality data. In this day and age, there's no excuse for 10 miles below Steveville, right bank, 100 feet above the river. You can get a handheld GPS. You can get survey grade GPS. You should be making quarry and site maps. You should be marking your sites on topo maps. Take digital photographs from the north, south, east, and west, and others in between. Print those images and identify them on the back as to what they are, and file them with the catalog records. Site photographs should have skylines visible. Without the skyline, they're useless for relocation purposes. And please collect the whole specimen. Don't sample it. Either collect the whole thing or leave it. So I think I've shown the importance of the work that I'm doing, relocating lost sites. I want to go back. I was looking for a sign about learning lessons, and I got this sign: old ways won't open new doors, and I totally disagree with that. Using old detective techniques, investigative techniques, I have opened new doors and new opportunities, as we've seen with the Oplocephalus skeleton. We may find more of the skeleton, we could have revised descriptions, and new opportunities have arose from old ways. So don't believe that sign. Okay, so wrapping up, I think you can see this pretty cool project. We're relocating lost sites, solving mystery quarries, gaining new scientific information from this work. But as a historian, I find it really cool to be able to stand in the footsteps of my forefathers. And with that, I'd like to end, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Okay, awesome talk. Thank you, Darren, for this great presentation. So before we move on with questions, just want to invite everyone to submit their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. But before we proceed with questions, I'd just like to invite all the audience to watch next week's talk by Dr. Susanna Maidment from the Natural History Museum in London, England, who will be talking about stegosaurs. So yeah, if you want to learn more about those armored dinosaurs or those plated dinosaurs, this will be the talk for you. So now I'll start. I see there's already questions that are coming in. So Darren, if you're ready, I'm going to ask you a few questions.
Sure.
We have a question from Robert asking how about the discovery of trash, so garbage left by former paleontologists. It says, why do you think our predecessors were so lackadaisical? Why were they so careless in their attitudes, basically?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Some did clean up their sites or left natural only material. So parts of wood or nails were left behind. But one person, Levi Sternberg, was, I don't know, I can't ask him, he's not with us anymore, but he left all his trash at his sites. And by doing so, if I find a site full of trash, I'm pretty sure automatically it's Levi Sternberg. And if there's sardine tins in the quarry, I know it's Levi Sternberg, because all the sites that were quarry staked that have garbage in them are all Levi Sternberg quarries. So we know automatically who was there just from the type of garbage left behind. But why they left it behind, I don't know. We leave some behind, like when we make a plaster jacket, sometimes the plaster slops on the ground and that dissolves away within a couple years. But the actual just abandonment of all the trash, I just don't know. It just, attitudes have changed, I guess.
Yeah, I think in the old days, it was just the attitude of getting rid of garbage, burying it, and then it would be out of sight, out of mind. But things have changed. I have a question from Sarah. She's asking, how much time do you spend on, she says, this particular project? I'm not sure which project she's referring to. It was early on. Maybe it was one of your early site discovery. But in general, how much time do you devote to mystery quarries?
Okay, the whole project started in around 1997. And I was looking through some old photographs at the Royal Trail Museum's library and realized I recognized a site. And when I took the photograph, I photocopied it, and I took the photocopy with me in the field and went to the site and realized it was a lost quarry that had not had a quarry stake put into it. And then looking into it a little bit more, we realized there was all kinds of technical and scientific information associated with it that was wrong. And that's how the project got started. But for each individual site, some I've been working on for 20 years, not every day, of course, but just it's on the back burner waiting for that new clue to come along. And other sites I have solved in 10 minutes. From the moment we found the site and I looked at the newspaper and did an internet search, I was able to solve the year, the crew, and if I have the field notes with me out there as well, what specimen it was. So it can take 10 years or it can take decades.
I have a question from Bill Bloss, who's asking the Blossom Quarry, which is a young tyrannosaur that was discovered about 5 years ago. Said that quarry has now completely disappeared except for some small pieces of plasters. How quickly can a quarry site disappear?
Some will last centuries, I think. I know that Dale Russell was looking for sites in the Drumheller Valley in the mid-1960s, and he was able to see chisel marks, distinguishable chisel marks in the rock from, I think it was like 1912. And so it depends on the rock. Like the sandstone erosion I showed after just a couple of years for the ankylosaur quarry, that is pretty firm rock, and yet it will erode very fast. As an experiment, years ago, I took a bunch of cyanoacrylite or crazy glue and squirted it on the top of a white sandstone outcrop to see what would happen. And 6 months later, after a relatively wet summer, I had a hoodoo with a glue cap rock 9 millimeters high. So we're looking at erosion rates of a centimeter, upwards of a centimeter a year for soft rock. Quarries in clay, there's a mosasaur that our museum excavated in the mid 80s, and it's gone. The quarry stake is still there, but you can see the hills creeping a little bit because the quarry stake is now leaning at about a 20-degree angle. So eventually that whole thing's just going to slump, and the site and the quarry stake will be gone as well. We've documented it with photographs, so if someone needs to go back, they could at least match the prairie level skyline and approximate where they are in the formation.
I have a question from Ian. He's asking, what went through your head and how did you feel when you stood up and recognized that wedge of clay in the wall behind the AMNH ankylosaur site?
Well, it was a huge light bulb moment, but it was unconfirmed, right? Because I didn't have the old photograph with me. So we printed, when we saw the photograph online, a number of us looked at it at the same time and said, yeah, that sure looks like it, but we weren't sure even then. And then when we took the photograph to the site, we knew. So it was a big eureka moment. And all of these sites, when they're solved, there's a eureka moment, some more loud than others. But with each one solved, that means there's less to solve. And so we're slowly solving where all these sites are. But as I said earlier, I will not be around when the last one is finally solved. I'll have to pass the torch to someone and train them. You know, talks like this will help others around the world too. I know that Philip Curry's work in Mongolia, he's been able to relocate sites from the 1960s and discover that they too left part of the animal behind. So he's reopening these quarries, and I'm not sure how he's going to reassociate them, if he's going to give the bones back to the original institution or not. I'm not sure how that will work. The bones were excavated in Mongolia by expeditions from Poland. So now we have dinosaurs in Poland prepared and described, and now we've got the rest of the animal still in the ground or excavated in Mongolia. And in Mongolia, I think will probably rightfully claim what was found later as theirs. So we're back in the same situation again, where 2 museums, 1 animal, 2 catalog numbers.
I have a question from Carol. She's asking, how are you marking sites now? Are you still using stakes?
The quarry staking program has been on the back burner for a long time, and we do talk about it from time to time that it should be resurrected. After Phil Curry left our museum, he started excavating his own sites in Dinosaur Park. We're still excavating our own sites in Dinosaur Park. Some of these quarry stakes are getting loose, so need to be restaked. And all the sites that I've solved need to get staked as well. And there's other places in the province that sites have been found where we need to quarry stake as well. So we should do it, but for now we are doing handheld GPS and survey grade or differential GPS. So we have the precise locality and site photographs if we decide to do it later on. But we are behind easily probably 150 sites that need to be done across Alberta. Philip Curry sites, Trail Museum sites, other trail staff sites, and my mystery lost quarry sites, and ones that need to be redone. Big job.
Cool. We have a message from Robert, who had asked a question. We misunderstood what he meant. Why were predecessors so careless? And he wasn't referring to the garbage left behind, but he meant about why did they fail to record all the information about the location of the quarry?
That, again, is a question. If I could go back in time, I would ask them, why did you do this? No one will ever come back to me as an old man and say, where did that bone come from? Because they're all properly documented. It's just the way it was done. You go back to like places like Wyoming, and there's North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, there's Triceratops skulls that have, dozens and dozens of them. And they just say, 10 miles north of Bob Jones's farm. And Bob Jones has gone. The family moved away, and no one knows where Bob Jones lived. It's just the way it was done. And they just didn't realize the importance of the stratigraphic context. Dinosaurs are evolving over time. And, if you find a specimen of really unique importance at the bottom of a formation versus the top, they could be different animals. But if neither one's got proper documentation, it just says Dinosaur Park, you don't know where it came from. And so there's a serious limiting factor on the scientific value. We have one skull in Dinosaur Park. It is quarry staked, but it's in what's called the Old Man Formation, which is the geological unit below when Centrosaurus existed. And it's a very important skull. We know it has to come from the Dinosaur Park Formation, but we don't know where. There's a photo of the skull in the field that appears in books or magazines from time to time. A couple years ago in Dinosaur Park, pre-COVID, the park gave us some old Sternberg photo albums, and there's the photograph of the skull plus 1/8 of an inch at the top, which all the other publications cropped off. And you can see rocks, you can see the edge of the river, you can see a tree. So I need to copy that photograph and go back to where the wrong quarry stake is and see if I can match that rock, the tree, the river, and then we'll dig the old quarry stake out and put it back where it properly came from. And then Dr. Brown of our museum can actually plot that in on his stratigraphic chart of major Centrosaurus specimens. It's an outlier right now. It's a beautiful, beautiful skull, one of the best skulls known, but we don't know where it came from. And they tried to show us in 1936, but they put the marker in the wrong spot.
I have a question from Alexandra. Are you going to be preserving the trash, newspaper, and other artifacts that you find at the quarries and catalog it?
Well, I hope to. It's a hard question to answer because it involves what's archaeological material, but the archaeologists that I've talked to aren't interested in it. It's just junk to them. So it's important, especially the newspaper. If someone disagrees with my interpretation that is a 1927 Royal Ontario Museum quarry based on a piece of newspaper, that newspaper has to be cataloged so someone can look at it and say, yeah, Tanke was right, or Tanke was wrong, and then go from there. But I'm very, very, very careful, except for that 5405. That was a shock. That was the first time out of some 80 sites that we were wrong. So it was the rug yanked out from under my feet.
Yeah.
So I will go forward with even more careful. It was a lesson learned for sure.
Cool. We have a question from Christopher. He's asking, were people, the paleontologists in the past, were they vague about the locations of their find on purpose to throw off the competition?
It's possible. There was a bit of an honor system. What the American Museum and the other teams would do, I don't know the exact details, but if I'm working for the American Museum and I find a skeleton that I want to dig up later that year, I marked it somehow with a stack of stones and maybe a yellow flag on it or something. That way the competing teams know that I've been there first and I claim it. But things were not always that friendly. You hear about friendly rivalry in Dinosaur Park, and not in 1914. The Sternbergs went further downriver and had bad luck, and they actually started to encroach on the eastern edge and into the American Museum's agreed upon collecting area. And Peter Kaizen of the American Museum actually was running around in the Badlands looking for the Sternbergs, and when he finally found them, he wagged his finger at him and said, "The word of a Sternberg is no good." And there's letters from Barnum Brown to his bosses complaining as well, and the bosses say, well, they showed us the way first, and there's lots of fossils for everyone, so be nice.
Yeah. have a question from Blandine. She said, in the future, in the case of new specimen parts being discovered, would you consider using histology to double check the assumptions made about parts that seem to belong to one and the same animal?
I don't know about histology, but relative bone lengths would be good. If I find an old quarry with a femur in it, a right femur that's been forgotten or abandoned, you then look for hadrosaurs that are missing a right femur, and you can also then look at the field notes where the crews were working and figure out who was where and when. But histology is getting a little, I think that's a little bit too detailed to prove it. That the trash works for me, so I'm happy for anyone to leave trash. And I must admit, the trash has given me such a thrill that whenever I work a quarry now, when we start a pile of rock, all the waste rubble that we dump off to the side, I always put at the very bottom a current issue of a newspaper and then bury it, knowing that in about 80 to 100 years, that newspaper will be found by someone whose father hasn't even been born yet. And they will look through that newspaper and be like, my God, gasoline, $1.35 a liter. They used gasoline back then. How environmentally unsafe.
Yeah. Yeah, the issue with histology too is that depending on which bone you're using, you get different ages for the same specimen. For example, the age of an animal based on the tibia will be different than the age based on the femur. So yeah, I'm not sure. You'd have to find probably something else more reliable.
Yeah.
Question from Mark. Mark Wildman. You mentioned that you had personally rediscovered around 40 lost quarries, but that there were many more to find. Are you prioritizing particular quarries to find, or are you relying on bumping into them while prospecting, or continuing to prioritize clusters?
I process them as I find them, but I do have, well, it's not a priority list. It's a list of one. There's a horned dinosaur called Spinops, which is a new dinosaur that we were involved in naming a number of years back. The site photograph, the camera's depressed into the ground, so all I see is bones in the ground, no skyline. I see shadows, so I know which way the camera was facing, but where it is, we don't know. The locality information's vague, so it's hard to know what side of the river we are on. We've explored one side and found nothing. What we did find while looking for the lost Spinops site from like 1916, we end up finding a lost turtle quarry from 1934. We found color print newspaper with Mickey Mouse cartoons, and I became a historian for Mickey Mouse cartoons for a couple days, trying to figure out the age of the newspaper. We didn't have the actual age of the newspaper at the time, so I did research on Mickey Mouse online and found 5 people that were really into Mickey Mouse cartoons and emailed them all the same email asking them if they could help me with my project. And they said, email this guy, he'll tell you exactly. And so it was a guy in Sweden, I think, and within an hour he sent me the whole cartoon and the date, everything. Wow. So we knew it was 1934. Yeah, but unfortunately I called the Royal Ontario Museum, who had the turtle, all excited to give them locality information, and they searched their records and realized that it had been discarded years earlier. So that was a bummer.
Yeah. We have a question, someone who is asking about the dilemma that you kind of alluded to. You said that earlier that people should not headhunt. They should either collect everything or leave everything in the ground. Is it more responsible to sample some of the specimen and leave the rest to be collected by others, or let the whole thing erode away and be lost to science?
I would say if it's worth collecting, collect the whole thing. If you're gonna put a shovel in the ground, do the whole thing. Like, that's how I was trained by Phil Curry. You're not going to sample it at all. And That's funny because when we solved that one duck-billed dinosaur skull, it was collected for the U of A by George Sternberg, and the skull was at the U of A. So I told Phil, I said, you told me never to collect part of the specimen. So I said, the onus is now on you to collect the skeleton in the ground. And he just looked at me and groaned and said, yeah, you're right. So they collected it, and it's been written up, and the skull's been reassociated with the skeleton. So that's good. And other people have been able to do that as well. So I would say collect the whole thing. If you're going to collect part of it, you have, if I'm going to collect part of it, then you, Francois, have to collect the rest of it. It has to stay in the same institution, because I've got at least 24 cases now where I know that single bones that we have found in Dinosaur Park fit onto animals in New York, in Chicago, in Ottawa, Toronto. So collect the whole thing. I wouldn't sample it. I mean, if it's under a 500-foot cliff and the head is sticking out, then I guess you're going to headhunt it. But if it's reasonably capable, if it's reasonably okay to remove the overburden, do it. Like one of the specimens that Phil Curry found in Mongolia, I think there's something like 80 feet of overburden on it, and I think they're going to go for it.
Wow.
Because there's some taxonomic questions as to the validity. There's 2 sauropods described from that formation, 2 different species or 2 different taxa, and there's some suspicions that they're both the same. But the parts to prove it are under the 80-foot cliff. So I would say collect the whole thing.
Cool. Question from Rich. Darren, are you planning, or have you already published in detail the historical methods to serve as a manual of source for future researchers? Particularly the ankylosaur example would make useful publication.
Yes, I have published a number of case reports of sites that I've solved, and this talk is being recorded, so it will also serve as a teaching manual or paper for future researchers looking for old sites. And I am asked on occasion, I get emails on occasion, or I get approached at conferences asking, I found this, and this. Could it be a paleontologist trash? The interesting thing with trash is that it's not always paleontologists. You could find on prairie level where farmers have dumped chicken wire and animal carcasses and lumber, and that all slides down into the Badlands. And it on first glimpse, it looks like paleontologist trash, but paleontologists don't have cows, right? They didn't use cows in the field, they used horses. So we can know that that's a farmer dumping trash. We also have drilling rigs near the edge of the Badlands long ago, and you find drill bits and braided cable and barrels, which are obviously not a dinosaur collector's trash. They're oil field related trash. So there are ways to tell if it's a dinosaur collector or not, especially if it's deep in the Badlands. It's not a rig. It's not a farmer carrying trash all the way in there. So that's another way I can eliminate trash as not being relevant to a quarry. I had one a number of years ago where people reported trash out in the Badlands, and I found a child's tricycle from the 50s.
Oh, wow.
I don't think the Sternbergs were peddling that around. So that was someone dumping trash into the Badlands, and someone had obviously picked the tricycle up and carried it further in, but it was not related to a quarry at all, of course.
Cool. Maybe one last question from Corbin. He's asking, actually, when would you expect the Royal Tyrrell Museum and the AMNH to start collaborating on that ankylosaur that's jointly basically owned, we could say, or collected, and for each museum to have a cast of each other's half?
Well, we need to finish preparing what we have. The Tail Club is completely prepared. The limb bones are almost completely prepared, and then COVID hit. We would like to explore the quarry a bit more. And if we find more material, we have to prepare that as well, collect it and prepare that. We need to verify that everything at the American Museum has been prepared as well. There's possibly still jackets unopened there that need to get prepared. So I don't want to put a timeline on it, But if there's no more specimens in the quarry, no more fossils in the quarry, everything's been prepared, and everyone agrees to do an exchange, it could happen within the next 5 years. But that's just a guesstimate.
Cool. Well, I think that answered all your questions. There's lots of comments. If you look in the comment box, lots of people saying great talks, and thank you, Darren, for great presentation. So, but I think in terms of questions, we've covered everything. So again, Darren, thank you very much for your time, for your passion, and for a great talk. Really interesting to see what's going on with that new ankylosaur, and hopefully we'll have everything prepared in the near future. If we can go back to normal after the COVID pandemic. And then I can't remember. You said there were more bones, right, in the field, right, still left in the ground.
We haven't seen any actual bones, but we have found the little pellets of bone, the little ossicles that are scattered about. So there's still a trail of things to look for, and we are missing those other major bones. The pelvis and the tail club were found very, very close together, but we're missing a string of vertebrae, probably 2 feet, 3 feet long, and we haven't seen any clue of them at all. So they're either still all articulated together nearby, or they fell apart completely and the water currents washed them away. So we just don't know. We don't have X-ray glasses, and Barnum Brown didn't either. Like, if they just dug back a little bit further, we wouldn't be giving this talk.
Yeah. Well, we'll be talking about a different specimen.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Darren, again for a great presentation. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining in today and for sending in questions. And again, I'd like to invite you to come back next week when we'll have Dr. Susie Maidman from the Natural History Museum in London to talk about stegosaurs. And again, with this, I'd like to thank you all again. And thank you, Darren. And see you next week.
Bye.